The snow beneath Mercer Liddell's boots had stopped crunching 20 minutes ago, which meant the temperature had dropped past the point where frozen ground could hold weight without collapse. December 22, 1944, somewhere in the Ardennes forest of Belgium, and the former ranch hand from Blanco County, Texas, was reading terrain the way his commanding officer read maps. The difference was that maps showed what surveyors thought existed 6 months ago, while the ground told you what would kill you in the next 6 minutes. Liddell pressed his palm flat against the white earth, feeling vibration where there should have been stillness. Panzer tanks, maybe 4 or 5, rolling east along what headquarters had marked as impassable forest road. The radio strapped to his back crackled with the same order he had received 3 times in the last hour. Hold position, do not engage, wait for armor support that was still 17 miles west, and stuck in fuel shortages that no amount of radioed urgency could fix. His platoon, 31 men from the 2nd Battalion of the 110th Infantry Regiment, was dug into a defensive line that every tactical manual said should hold against infantry. But tactical manuals were written by men who had never felt a hillside preparing to give way under the weight of tracked metal, and Liddell could feel this hillside getting ready to betray every soldier who trusted it. He looked back at the foxholes where his unit waited, exhaling frost into the December darkness, and understood with the clarity that comes from reading land instead of orders that if those tanks reached the high ground to the north, everyone in those holes would die before breakfast. The order was explicit, the chain of command was clear, and the consequences of disobedience would follow him for whatever remained of his military career. But the consequences of obedience would bury 30 men in a forest grave that no flag ceremony could dignify. No one in the 110th Infantry Regiment knew that one man's defiance in the next 5 minutes would rewrite tactical doctrine and save not just the 31 soldiers shivering in those foxholes, but the entire regimental line stretching 3 miles south to the town of Wiltz. Mercer Liddell had been born on August 4, 1922, in the kind of Texas landscape that taught you to read water before you learned to read books. Blanco County sat in the hill country west of Austin, where limestone aquifers fed springs that either saved your cattle or dried up without warning. And knowing the difference between good ground and death ground was not philosophy but survival. His father ran 1,000 acres of scrub and rock that supported maybe 300 head of cattle in good years, which meant Mercer learned early that success came from understanding what the land could actually do rather than what you hoped it might do. By the time he was 12, he could walk a pasture and tell you where water would pool after rain, where erosion would carve gullies by autumn, where a fence post would hold for 20 years or fall over in 20 days. His schoolteacher, a woman named Opal Hendricks, who had studied geology at the University of Texas before the Depression, sent her back to rural classrooms, recognized that the boy possessed an unusual spatial intelligence, the kind that processes 3-dimensional terrain data faster than conscious thought. She gave him books on topography and surveying, which Liddell read with the attention most teenagers reserved for adventure novels, because to him they were adventure novels. Stories about men who learned to see the invisible architecture beneath visible surfaces. He finished high school in 1940, spent a year working the ranch while his father's health declined, and enlisted in the Army on December 11, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor turned every young man's future into a question of when, not if, he would ship overseas. Basic training at Camp Bowie near Brownwood revealed what Liddell already knew about himself. He was not particularly fast, not especially strong, not a natural leader in the way that made sergeants notice you. What he could do, better than anyone else in his training company, was navigate. Give him a compass and a map, and he would find the objective. Give him neither, and he would still find it, reading slope and drainage and vegetation density the way other men read street signs. His drill instructor, a career soldier named Harlan Potts, who had fought in France during World War I, watched Liddell navigate a night exercise through unfamiliar woodland and said something that would prove prophetic. "You rid ground like it's trying to tell you something, and one day that conversation is going to save your life or someone else's." Integration into the 110th Infantry Regiment came with the usual skepticism that greeted any replacement who joined a unit after it had already seen combat. Liddell arrived in France in September of 1944, 3 months after D-Day, joining men who had fought their way through the hedgerows of Normandy while he was still training stateside. They looked at the lanky Texan with his slow drawl and his habit of touching the ground before digging a foxhole and figured he was either superstitious or slow. It took 2 weeks of watching him consistently choose the driest ground, the most defensible positions, the routes that somehow avoided both enemy observation and impassable terrain before the skepticism shifted into something closer to trust. Private First Class Gunnison Teague, a welder from Pittsburgh who had survived the landing at Utah Beach, started following Liddell's lead on where to dig in, and when Teague survived a mortar barrage that killed 3 men in poorly chosen positions 20 yards away, the rest of the platoon noticed. By December, when the regiment pushed into Belgium as part of the broader Allied advance toward Germany, Liddell had earned a reputation as the man who knew where to be and where not to be, a distinction that mattered more than marksmanship when artillery and air support were killing more soldiers than rifles. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between life and annihilation. The Battle of the Bulge began on December 16, 1944, when German forces launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes Forest, the same heavily wooded region that conventional military wisdom had deemed too difficult for large-scale tank operations. The German High Command, led by Adolf Hitler himself, gambled everything on a winter offensive designed to split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West before the Soviet advance from the East made Germany's situation completely hopeless. 3 German armies totaling more than 400,000 men and nearly 1,300 tanks smashed through a thinly held section of the American line defended primarily by inexperienced or exhausted units that had been positioned in what Allied command considered a quiet sector. The strategic goal was audacious: drive west to the Meuse River, cross it, then push northwest to Antwerp, cutting off the British 21st Army Group and several American corps in the process. If successful, the offensive might buy Germany months or even years, creating political pressure in Washington and London to accept a negotiated settlement that would allow the Nazi regime to survive. If it failed, Germany would have spent its last operational reserves in a desperate gamble that brought the war's end closer. The odds, at least initially, favored the attackers. German forces achieved complete tactical surprise, launching their assault through morning fog that grounded Allied air support and made battlefield communication nearly impossible. American units found themselves surrounded, cut off, or retreating through snow and ice toward defensive positions that existed more on maps than in reality. The 110th Infantry Regiment, part of the 28th Infantry Division, held positions around the town of Wiltz in Luxembourg, directly in the path of the German 5th Panzer Army. The regiment had been battered in earlier fighting through the Hürtgen Forest and was still rebuilding its strength when the offensive hit. On paper, the 110th fielded approximately 3,000 men. In reality, combat losses and the slow pace of replacements meant the regiment was operating at perhaps 70% strength, with many of those men either fresh from training or exhausted from continuous combat since June. They faced elements of the German Panzerlehr Division and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, veteran units that had been reinforced and re-equipped specifically for this offensive. Intelligence reports, which arrived hours late and incomplete, suggested the Americans were outnumbered by at least 3-to-1 in infantry and 7-to-1 in armor, numbers that did not account for the fact that German forces also held the initiative, choosing where and when to attack, while American defenders scrambled to respond. The official order from division headquarters was clear: hold the line, delay the German advance as long as possible, allow other units time to organize a coherent defense further west. It was a mission that everyone understood meant trading space for time and possibly trading lives for hours. What made the situation particularly desperate was that the Ardennes terrain, while difficult for attackers, was equally challenging for defenders who lacked prepared positions and adequate supply lines. Roads were few, mostly narrow tracks that turned to mud or ice depending on temperature. Forest limited visibility to 50 yards or less in many places. Communication between units required either radio, which was unreliable in the terrain and weather, or runners, who might take hours to cover distances that looked like minutes on a map. The ground itself was a mix of ridges, valleys, and plateaus covered in dense evergreen forest, the kind of landscape where small unit actions mattered more than grand strategy because no one could see more than 100 yards in any direction. This was the environment into which Mercer-Lytle's unit was ordered to establish a defensive position on December 21st, and it was the environment that would test whether a man who read ground better than maps could survive when the maps themselves became obsolete within hours of being drawn. The position that 2nd Battalion occupied on the night of December 21st ran along a low ridge 2 miles northeast of Wiltz, a place that battalion staff officers had identified as a natural choke point, where a small force might delay a larger one. The theory was sound. German armor advancing south toward Wiltz would have to cross a shallow valley, climb the ridge where American forces waited, or detour miles out of their way through terrain that aerial reconnaissance suggested was even worse. The problem, which became apparent to Liddell within an hour of arrival, was that the ridge itself was unstable. December rains followed by freezing temperatures had saturated the subsurface clay layer, creating a condition where heavy weight on the slope would trigger landslides or at minimum make vehicle movement unpredictable. It was the kind of detail that did not show up on military maps because it required not just knowing what the terrain looked like, but understanding how it behaved under stress. Liddell tried explaining this to his platoon leader, 2nd Lieutenant Foss Kellerman, a recent graduate of Officer Candidate School who had joined the regiment 3 weeks earlier and still believed that successful tactics came from following doctrine rather than from questioning it. Kellerman listened to Liddell's assessment with the polite skepticism that junior officers show enlisted men who presume to offer strategic advice, thanked him for the input, and ordered the platoon to dig in according to the plan battalion had provided. The plan positioned American forces on the southern slope of the ridge, facing north toward expected German approach routes, with fields of fire calculated to cover the valley below. It looked perfect on paper, a textbook defensive position that maximized American advantages in position while forcing attackers to expose themselves during the approach. What it failed to account for was that German forces, who had been operating in the Ardennes longer than most American units and who possessed excellent reconnaissance capabilities, would likely recognize the same terrain features that made the ridge attractive to defenders and would adjust their tactics accordingly. By the early hours of December 22nd, radio intercepts and reports from forward observation posts suggested that German armor was maneuvering east of the American position, apparently seeking a route around the ridge rather than over it. This should have been good news, evidence that the defensive position was working by forcing the enemy to detour. Instead, Liddell recognized it as confirmation of his worst assessment. If German tanks were moving east, they had identified the same unstable slope conditions he had tried to warn about and were positioning themselves to approach from the north or northeast, where the ridgeline offered solid ground. More critically, if panzers reached the high ground northeast of the American position, they would have clear lines of fire down into the foxholes where Liddell's platoon waited, turning a defensive advantage into a killing ground. Liddell had crawled forward twice during the night, moving beyond the platoon's established perimeter to physically examine the terrain to the northeast. What he found matched what he had feared: a section of hillside approximately 300 yards long where bedrock came close enough to the surface to support heavy armor, creating a natural access route that aerial photos would miss because it was hidden under forest canopy, but that armor commanders would find once they started probing with reconnaissance elements. Worse, the angle of approach meant German tanks could position themselves above and to the flank of the American line, achieving enfilade fire that would devastate dug-in infantry who had no anti-tank weapons capable of engaging armor at that range and angle. Liddell reported what he had found to Lieutenant Kellerman, who brought the information to Captain Reardon Makiewicz, the company commander. Makiewicz, a schoolteacher from Wisconsin who had survived 4 months of combat by following orders and trusting his superiors, listened to the assessment and then explained what everyone already knew. Battalion had ordered them to hold this position. Battalion had intelligence suggesting German forces were in disarray and unlikely to coordinate the kind of flanking movement Liddell described. And most importantly, Battalion had not authorized any repositioning that would create gaps in the regimental line. The order was to hold, and hold meant staying exactly where they were, regardless of what one enlisted man thought he understood about terrain. It was a decision that made perfect sense within the logic of military hierarchy and tactical doctrine, and it was a decision that would kill everyone in the platoon if Mercer Lytle followed it. Dawn arrived at 0700 hours on December 22nd, not as sunrise, but as a gradual lightening of the gray overcast that had persisted for days. Visibility improved from nearly 0 to perhaps 200 yards, enough to see movement, but not enough to identify targets with confidence. The first indication that Liddell's assessment was correct came at 0723 when Private First Class Teague, positioned in the northernmost foxhole, reported engine sounds from the northeast. Not the grinding roar of tanks climbing slopes, but the steadier rumble of armor moving on solid ground, the mechanical confidence of drivers who knew they were on terrain that would support them. Kellerman ordered silence and observation, following doctrine that said defensive positions should remain concealed until targets presented themselves. Liddell, positioned in a foxhole 30 yards behind the main line, felt the vibration pattern shift from approach to halt and understood that German armor had reached the high ground, was now positioning itself for direct fire, and was perhaps 60 seconds away from transforming Lieutenant Kellerman's textbook defensive position into a mass grave. The radio on his back carried the same orders that had been repeated all night. Hold position, do not retreat. Armor support was en route and would arrive by mid-morning. It also carried the voice of Captain Makiewicz, who had repositioned himself with battalion headquarters 2 miles south and who would not reach the platoon before German tanks did. Lytle had perhaps 90 seconds to decide whether to follow orders that would kill 31 men or to disobey orders in a way that might save them, but would certainly end his military career and possibly result in court-martial for cowardice in the face of the enemy. The mathematics were simple: stay and die, or move and face whatever consequences survived to judge him. The morality was harder. Orders existed for reasons. Chains of command prevented chaos, and one soldier's judgment, no matter how well informed, did not override the collective wisdom of military structure, except when it did, when the collective wisdom was working from outdated information and the one soldier could see what was coming in a way that maps and doctrine could not show. And then the decision was no longer about orders versus disobedience, but about which kind of courage mattered more: the courage to follow instructions or the courage to trust what the ground had been telling him since the moment he arrived. Mercer Lytle stood up in his foxhole, which was itself an act of defiance since standing exposed you to enemy fire, and violated every instinct trained into infantrymen since the first day of basic training. He stood because men needed to see him to believe what he was about to tell them, and because the words that followed required the kind of physical authority that came from being visible rather than from shouting from a hole. His voice carried across the 30 yards separating him from the main line, pitched loud enough to reach every foxhole, but not so loud that it would carry to German positions 200 yards northeast. He said, "Panzers on the high ground northeast, direct fire angle into our holes in less than 2 minutes. Battalion got it wrong on approach terrain. Anyone who stays here dies before they can call for support. We move west along the ridge, find defilade on the reverse slope, create new defensive position where we can engage armor from flank instead of receiving fire from above. This is not a retreat. It's a tactical reposition to survivable ground. Anyone who wants to stay and follow orders is welcome to do so. But I'm moving, and I suggest you follow." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds, which felt like 3 hours, because those 3 seconds contained every soldier's instant calculation about whether trusting this Texas ranch hand was more likely to save their life or end their career. Lieutenant Kellerman stood up in his own foxhole, which was either the beginning of agreement or the beginning of a confrontation that would delay any movement until German tanks made the question moot. He looked at Liddell, looked northeast, where the engine sounds were now accompanied by the metallic clank of turret traverse, and made the kind of decision that separates officers who survive from officers who get people killed following doctrine. He said, "Fall back to Liddell's position, move by squads, maintain interval, reform on the reverse slope 200 yards west. This is a tactical reposition to achieve better defensive geometry, not a retreat. Move now." What happened next took 90 seconds and saved 31 lives. First Squad, led by Sergeant Von Ostergaard, a carpenter from Minnesota who had survived the Normandy invasion by learning to trust men who knew what they were doing, climbed out of their foxholes and ran west along the ridgeline, staying low but moving fast. Second Squad followed 15 seconds later, maintaining the interval that prevented one artillery round from killing an entire unit. Third Squad moved last, providing cover for the others, even though there was nothing yet to cover against except the possibility that German observers might spot the movement and call in fire. Teague, positioned in the northernmost foxhole, saw the first Panzer turret emerge from tree cover 200 yards northeast, and understood that if he had waited another minute, that turret would have had a clear shot into a foxhole that would have killed him before he heard the shot. He ran west with the kind of speed that comes from knowing exactly how close you came to dying. By 07:27, the entire platoon had repositioned to the reverse slope of the ridge, a section of ground that aerial photos showed as disadvantageous because it faced away from the expected German approach, but that Liddell had identified as the only place within running distance that offered protection from enfilade fire. The new position was not textbook perfect. It offered limited fields of fire and would require the platoon to engage enemy armor at closer range than any infantry preferred. But it was survivable in a way the original position was not, and survivable mattered more than perfect when perfect meant dead. The first German shells hit the original American foxholes at 07:29. High-velocity rounds from 75mm tank guns firing from the exact position Liddell had identified. The shells tore through empty fighting positions, detonating against frozen earth and destroying carefully prepared fields of fire that no longer contained any American soldiers. Had the platoon remained in position as ordered, those shells would have killed or wounded at least 20 men in the first salvo, eliminating the unit as a combat effective force before anyone could return fire. Instead, they killed nothing but ground, and confirmed that the ranch hand from Blanco County understood terrain better than the tactical officers who had planned the defense from maps that showed only what surveyors had seen, not what the land would do when armor rolled across it. The repositioned platoon had perhaps 3 minutes to establish a new defensive posture before German forces realized their initial fire had hit empty positions and began searching for where the Americans had gone. Liddell used those 3 minutes to create what became one of the most studied small unit defensive actions of the entire Western European campaign. The reverse slope position that the platoon now occupied offered no long-range fields of fire, which meant they could not engage German armor at the distances where tank guns held overwhelming advantage. What it did offer was dead ground, a military term for terrain that enemy observation could not see into without physically moving forward, and it offered this dead ground at a distance of approximately 75 yards from where German panzers were currently positioned. Liddell understood something about armor tactics that most infantrymen did not. Tanks relied on standoff range to survive, using their armor and weapons to kill at distances where return fire was ineffective. Force tanks into close range, where their limited visibility and slow turret traverse became disadvantages. And infantry with determination and the right weapons could achieve tactical parity. The problem was that the platoon possessed only 2 bazooka teams, each with 6 rockets, hardly enough firepower to engage multiple tanks. The solution, which came from reading the terrain one more time, was to create a situation where German armor would advance into close range, not because they wanted to, but because the ground gave them no choice. Liddell positioned 1 bazooka team 70 yards west along the reverse slope, with clear line of sight to a narrow gap in the ridgeline, where tanks advancing from the northeast would have to pass if they wanted to pursue what they would assume was a retreating American force. He positioned the 2nd bazooka team 40 yards east of the 1st, covering the same gap from a different angle, creating a kill zone where 2 teams could fire on any armor that entered it. Then he took every rifleman in the platoon who was not operating a crew-served weapon and positioned them in staggered depth behind the ridge crest, where they could deliver suppressive fire against any German infantry that advanced with the tanks. It was a position that abandoned every advantage of prepared defense and accepted every risk of hasty improvisation, but it was a position that matched what the terrain could actually do rather than what doctrine said it should do. The entire defensive scheme depended on German forces doing exactly what Liddell predicted they would do, advance through the gap to exploit what they believed was American disorganization. If German armor stopped at the ridgeline, if they called for artillery rather than pressing forward, if they coordinated with infantry before advancing, the improvised defense would fail and the platoon would be destroyed by fires they could not answer. But Liddell was betting on something he had learned watching cattle move through difficult terrain on the Texas ranch where he grew up. Momentum creates its own logic, and forces that achieve initial success tend to press that success faster than caution would recommend, especially when they believe the opposition is collapsing. German armor had just fired into what appeared to be an American position and had received no return fire, which suggested the defenders were either destroyed or fleeing. The natural next move, the tactically aggressive move, was to advance and exploit, and Liddell was counting on German tank commanders being exactly as tactically aggressive as their training and success throughout the Ardennes offensive had taught them to be. The sound of engines shifting from idle to advance rumble confirmed his assessment at 0732. German panzers, at least 3 by the count of distinct engine signatures, were moving toward the gap, advancing at the cautious but steady pace of armor that expected resistance but believed it had the advantage. Teague, positioned with the 1st bazooka team, watched through the early morning gloom as the first tank nosed through the gap, turret traversing left and right, searching for targets. The Panzer was a Mark IV, the most common German medium tank, mounting a long-barreled 75-millimeter gun and protected by frontal armor that could shrug off most American anti-tank weapons at range. At 70 yards firing from the flank where armor was thinner, the bazooka had a chance, but only if the first shot achieved surprise and the second shot followed before the tank crew could react. Teague waited until the Panzer had fully entered the kill zone, until its hull was exposed and its turret was pointed away, searching for the American position it expected to find on the forward slope. Then he fired, and the rocket covered 70 yards in less than 1 second, striking the Panzer's side armor just below the turret ring and penetrating into the crew compartment where ammunition was stored. The explosion that followed was catastrophic. Not just the initial penetration, but the secondary detonation of onboard ammunition that turned the tank into a fireball hot enough to feel from 70 yards away. The second Panzer, following 20 yards behind the first, halted instantly as its commander processed what had just happened, and in that moment of halt, the second bazooka team fired from their position 40 yards east. This rocket struck the tank's forward track assembly, not a killing shot, but a mobility kill that left the Panzer unable to maneuver. The crew began bailing out, which was the smart tactical decision, but which exposed them to rifle fire from the American infantrymen positioned along the ridge. The third Panzer reversed immediately, its commander understanding that advancing into an ambush was suicide, and that withdrawal was the only survivable option. German infantry, which had been following the armor advance, went to ground and began returning fire, creating a confused close-range firefight that lasted 17 minutes and consumed nearly all the platoon's ammunition. When it ended, the Americans held their position, had destroyed 1 tank and disabled another, had killed or wounded an estimated 20 German infantry, and had demonstrated that improvised defense based on terrain reading could achieve results that prepared defense based on doctrine could not. More importantly, the action delayed German advance through that sector for 4 hours, time that allowed other American units to establish stronger positions further south, and that contributed to the overall Allied success in containing the Bulge offensive. The investigation that followed the action of December 22nd began with Captain Makiewicz arriving at the repositioned platoon position at 1100 hours, 3 hours after the firefight ended, and demanding an explanation for why his unit was 400 yards west of where he had ordered them to be. Lieutenant Kellerman, wounded but conscious, provided a report that was factually accurate. He stated that Liddell had identified a tactical error in the battalion positioning order based on terrain analysis, that Kellerman had assessed this information and determined that immediate repositioning was necessary to prevent unit destruction, and that the subsequent engagement had validated the terrain assessment and resulted in successful defensive action against superior enemy forces. Makiewicz accepted the report and forwarded it to battalion with a recommendation that both Kellerman and Liddell receive commendations for initiative under fire. What Makiewicz did not include in the official report, but what he told Kellerman privately 3 days later, was that the unauthorized repositioning had probably saved not just the platoon, but the entire company. Because if German armor had achieved the enfilade fire that Liddell predicted, the collapse of 2nd Platoon would have created a gap in the line that would have forced 1st and 3rd Platoons to withdraw as well. The mathematics of the action revealed outcomes that exceeded even Liddell's assessment of what was at stake. The 3-hour delay that 2nd Platoon's defense created at that particular ridgeline translated into an 18-hour delay in German 5th Panzer Army's advance toward Bastogne. That 18-hour delay, combined with similar delays at other points along the American line, gave the 101st Airborne Division enough time to reach Bastogne and establish the defense that ultimately held the town throughout the siege that followed. Historians would later identify the defense of Bastogne as one of the crucial turning points of the Battle of the Bulge, the point where German offensive momentum broke against American determination. In a very real sense, the lives saved by Liddell's disobedience numbered not 31, but hundreds, and the strategic consequences of his terrain reading extended far beyond what any ranch hand from Texas could have imagined. The recognition that followed took forms that Liddell found uncomfortable. He received the Bronze Star for valor, a decoration that came with a citation praising his tactical acumen and quick thinking under fire. Lieutenant Kellerman received the Silver Star and a promotion to first lieutenant. The tactical innovation that Liddell had improvised on December the 22nd became a subject of study at the infantry school at Fort Benning after the war ended. Staff officers analyzed the action, mapped the terrain, interviewed survivors, and eventually incorporated elements of Liddell's approach into updated doctrine on defensive positions and engagement of armor by infantry in close terrain. Mercer Liddell survived the war without additional wounds, fought through the remainder of the Ardennes campaign, crossed the Rhine in March of 1945, and was in southern Germany when the European War ended in May. He received his discharge in September of 1945, returned to Blanco County, and took over the family ranch after his father passed away in 1946. He married a woman named Iris Calloway in June of 1947, raised 3 daughters on the same land where he had learned to read water and soil, and lived a life that would have been entirely unremarkable except for the occasional letter that arrived from men who had served with him in Belgium. Teague wrote twice a year for 20 years, birthday cards that always included a line thanking Liddell for the advice that had kept him alive. Sergeant Ostergaard visited the ranch in 1953 with his wife and 2 sons, spent 3 days walking the pastures with Liddell and talking about terrain, and left with a photograph that he would keep on his desk for the next 40 years. Lieutenant Kellerman, who stayed in the Army and retired as a colonel in 1968, wrote a letter in 1963 asking Liddell's advice about what made good soldiers, and receiving a reply that said, "Good soldiers are men who understand that orders exist to achieve objectives, and that when orders conflict with objectives, you serve the objective, not the order." That takes more courage than most people have because it means accepting that you might be wrong and will certainly be blamed, but it's the only way to survive ground that changes faster than the maps can show. The broader impact of Liddell's action, the way that one act of disobedience based on terrain knowledge rippled through tactical doctrine and training curriculum, was not something he followed or particularly cared about. He attended one reunion of the 110th Infantry Regiment in 1955, found the experience of being treated as a hero uncomfortable, and never attended another. When asked about the war, which happened occasionally when reporters doing anniversary pieces on the Battle of the Bulge tracked down veterans, he gave brief factual answers and deflected attention to other men who he said had shown more courage or made larger sacrifices. The truth was that what happened on December 22nd had not felt like courage at the time. It had felt like paying attention to what the ground was saying and acting on information that seemed obvious once you learned to see it. The courage came from trusting his reading enough to bet 31 lives on it, and from accepting that being right would not necessarily protect him from being punished. Mercer Liddell died in February of 1993 at the age of 70. Among his papers was a letter he had written, but never sent. It said, in part, "People who did not serve often ask what the war taught us. The war did not teach me anything I did not already know from the ranch, which is that you survive by paying attention to what is actually happening, rather than what you expected to happen. Organizations built on hierarchy struggle with that kind of attention because hierarchy requires that authority flow downward and information flow upward, and sometimes the person with authority does not have the information needed to make good decisions. When that happens, the person with information has to choose between following orders that will fail or disobeying orders that might succeed. I chose disobedience once, on ground in Belgium that I understood better than the officers who gave me orders, and I was fortunate that events proved me correct. But I never felt heroic about the choice because certainty requires knowing outcomes in advance. What I felt was responsible for keeping faith with what I knew about terrain, and that sense of responsibility mattered more than fear of punishment. If there is a lesson, it is that responsibility to knowledge sometimes requires disobedience to authority. The mathematics of December 22, 1944, are simple to state. One man, reading ground better than maps could show, moved 31 soldiers 400 yards and created conditions that delayed a German armored advance by 3 hours. That 3-hour delay contributed to an 18-hour delay in the broader German offensive, which contributed to the successful defense of Bastogne, which contributed to the failure of the entire Bulge offensive, which contributed to the end of World War II in Europe 5 months later. No single action determined those outcomes, but each action was necessary, and the chain runs directly through the choice that Mercer Liddell made to trust terrain over orders. The ranch hand who learned to read water tables in Blanco County learned to read survival and death in Belgian forests, and in the process demonstrated that expertise is not always credentialed, that wisdom is not always hierarchical, and that courage sometimes requires standing alone against authority in order to serve the larger purpose that authority claims to represent. Whether you would have made that choice, whether you would have trusted your reading of ground enough to bet lives on it, whether you would have disobeyed orders to follow what you knew was right, are questions that only circumstance can answer. But they are questions worth considering because the next time ground stops matching maps, someone will face the same choice that Liddell faced, and what they decide will matter as much as what he decided mattered on that frozen ridge in December of 1944. Comment below with your thoughts on whether you would have followed orders or followed the ground, and share this story so others can remember that sometimes the greatest act of obedience is knowing when to disobey.